Because while we've seen record growth in renewables and in clean energy investment over the last several years, that hasn't changed the fact that oil use and gas use and coal use and emissions have continued to rise at the same time, as we've been, many of us at the center, writing for a long time. Two things can both be true at the same time. And now in this increasingly fractured world that we are in, again, you see waning support in some parts of the world for climate action. It's left some parts of the clean energy transition's future in doubt. We do see some pullback in commitments that some have made. So just globally, there's a reevaluation underway of how policymakers achieve all of our energy policy objectives at the same time.
There is a race, and it feels as if you win it permanently. There is no catching up. It's not like the information age where you get to learn from all this. Like China had all these factories and they learned from the US. This is going to be very opaque. You're not going to see what's going on inside of the AI. You're not going to be able to do as much espionage. You're not going to be able to steal as much data because it's inside. You can't just hire the AI away. And so this is a life and death moment for some superpowers right now.
And we're in a place where I think a very important myth has been busted twice in the last 3 years at very high consequence. And that myth is that highly integrated economies won't do much to jeopardize that relationship because of the importance of economic interdependence. So the first time that myth was busted was with the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, where the whole idea that that interdependence was going to be a buffer against actions that were not seen as being in short-term interest. And now we're seeing it this morning with a real trade war between the US and China, with the US having 104% tariffs on Chinese goods and the Chinese bringing their tariffs up to 84% and a number of other things that go alongside that.
I would say we've kind of gone to a reset of the kind of the orthodoxy, the kind of organizing principle of the first Trump administration that looked at energy through very clearly through a security lens. You've seen that illustrated multiple times, just in virtue of you can look at the executive orders that have been issued. 3 of those, the Unleashing American Energy Dominance, Declaration of an Energy Emergency, and then on the critical minerals executive order, and of course that we can talk about in the context of the tariffs as well. So I would look at it in terms of the energy space, a very clear reorganization and a recognition of energy.
I think that we should challenge the idea that we're in a stable move to a multipolar environment. You hear a lot about a multipolar world. That conjures up to me, do you remember when you did chemistry, there were sort of 6 or 7 different colored balls and there were rods holding them together. It suggested a stable ecosystem. I think we're moving into a much more fluid, much more volatile, much more dangerous situation, which I think was an Indian diplomat 15 or 20 years ago called it a multi-aligned world.
If we don't add more clean energy into the mix, we actually won't have enough of the energy. If we didn't add all that we have done so far in the last 15 years on the clean energy side, then fossil fuels would not have gone from 85 to 80%, they would have gone from 85 to 95% relative to demand. Demand is going up. And I don't think personally, I don't think the solution is to increase coal production in increasingly residential areas, but rather to see how we continue this energy addition to turn it into an energy transition.
But we have not backed away from some of the emission reduction targets that we've set years ago, and those include having our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. We're nearly there, actually, even though we've got 5 more years. But it also includes, uniquely, I think, to our company, a scope 3 target, so reducing the emissions of the products that we sell. So that is all about customer demand, but it's also about how we engage with our customers, how we engage with policymakers. And that is a 15 to 20% reduction in the emissions of the products we sell between 2021 and 2030.
We know we have increased energy needs for AI. We know the geopolitics is different. And I completely understand the need for the emphasis on energy access, energy affordability, and energy security. Those are legitimate concerns. But I think what isn't as widely understood as it needs to be is that you can't have any of those three without having climate stability. And so we have to solve for all four things at once. And the idea that we can shut our eyes and pretend climate change isn't happening is downright reckless.
First of all, I think you got to step back and say what's really going to drive this, and I think it's going to be demand. We heard from the first speaker this morning how important it is to win the AI race globally. And so whatever numbers you believe in, the projection of using natural gas for AI generation is anywhere from 3 to maybe 8 BCF a day. So to put that in context, we move around 110 to maybe 115 BCF a day every day here in the United States on average. So it's a decently small percentage.
There is no question, the science is very clear, that to limit the worst impacts of climate change, we not only have to get emissions to zero as rapidly as possible, but also we need to go actually negative in all likelihood to limit the worst effects of climate change. That is a huge challenge, and I think the crux of the issue actually is not what does the science say, it is what does as rapidly as possible mean?
And there has been a lot of speculation that under current uncertainties, global uncertainties, will the European climate action be also derailed? And I think that I can say that no, that will not happen, because the latest announcements by the European Commission have been very clear that Europe's commitment to become climate neutral by 2050 is still in place. It is set in our climate law. And there are some discussions what should be achieved by 2040, 10 years prior to the final date. There are strong supporters of the approach that at least 90% of CO2 emissions should be cut by 2040. And how Europe achieves that, until now, the main driver has been carbon pricing.
So, at a broad level, the Cassidy bill, the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, is similar to the EU CBAM in that both levy a fee on imported goods at the border that is linked in some way to the carbon intensity of those goods, how they were made, manufactured, depending on how you define it, the transportation emissions. But beyond that, they're very different bills. And I do think they speak to a pretty notable divergence in how the US and the EU are thinking about trade policy and the global trade system.
Asia has been growing through the expansion of trade, but CBAM imposes a de facto tariffs against exports. And initially, it started with 5 sectors, but now it is expanded to cover more sectors. And if I'm not mistaken, the downstream products of steel, including screws and bolts, are covered by CBAM. Frankly, I'm not so sure to what extent screws or bolts would affect the global climate overall in terms of magnitude.
It's really important, and I hear it all the time with talking to investors and companies, to recognize that the idea that both governments and industry were moving de facto in a direction of efficiency of supply chains, lowering cost for consumers, and that was sort of the due north of what we were doing in a global trade architecture. That is no longer a thing we can count on. And that isn't just true in the last couple of weeks. It is true in the context of the last, probably 8 to 10 years or so.
There is a fair amount of double counting in some of these load forecasts. And that is a challenge for people who are trying to project ahead as to what we will need in order to meet the demand. And I think that's where some of the, David mentioned the idea of flexibility, some creativity among those of us who are responsible for operating this power grid is really going to be needed. We have to meet this load. We have to be able to do that. We have always done that. There was times when load growth was way larger than 2% a year back in the 50s, 8, 9% a year. We all know why that was happening. We met it then, we can meet it now, but we are gonna have to work hard at how to get the efficiency out of the system that's there and that's latent that we haven't been using when demand growth was flat.
I think first and foremost is looking at where we're gonna go build data centers and grow that demand to meet this intelligence economy that continues to grow and the need for compute resources, let alone generative AI resources, is to ensure we're bringing more power to those systems and more power to those grids where we're adding load. The second piece is how do we do that and ensure as much of that is as carbon-free as possible? We have a goal to match all of our load with 100% renewable energy by 2025, by this year, and we're on track to do that. And one of the things to do that is ensuring that as we grow load, we're growing the role of power purchase agreements as well.
So this urgent demand for clean, reliable power from data centers and a higher willingness to pay for those services is making a lot of the energy providers, including many nuclear companies, very optimistic that this demand will help move them through the valley of death and to their first of a kind and to nth of a kind products that will ultimately be competitive in the bulk power market, but immediately could meet the needs of this market. And then I think AI as a tool has the potential to be transformative as well.
The data center operators are desperate for speed to power. And so if there's a way to say, we're gonna connect and manage, rather than saying your interconnection's gonna start at 9 nines and be Cadillac level service right out of the gate, if they can accept something that's more like a Camry, or I guess in our trade era, maybe I should use a GM brand, but I think there's a big opportunity for policy to be a part of accelerating the interconnection, to just say, let's change the service level. It's not the first thing we'd probably shed, but in order to get you connected quicker, let's adjust what we usually would sell you.
These materials are abundant. They're going to be low cost eventually. A lot of technology processing investments coming in other parts of the world, especially in Asia. So we are actually at a challenge to be more like tech companies. However, this being mining, how do we do that? Because we have natural cycles of development. They're, in a way, longer. Well, is tech focus, shortening those cycles, reacting? I think the reaction speed needs to change. We need to change as an industry.
So both economically and national security, the demand is enormous. Just to put that in some kind of layperson's perspective, we're going to need to mine more in the next 30 years than we have in the last 70,000 years. And yet the sector is incredibly concentrated. I mean, you compare it with oil and gas, where there's something like several players on 15% of the market. China is, you're talking about concentration of 60% up to 95%, depending on the mineral. I think we invest in a graphite company in Brazil, it's 80% concentration.
We all know that the energy transition is happening. We all know that the electrification society is happening. We all know that there's been sold more and more EVs. It's a given that there will be more demand for lithium 10 years from now. But I don't know. Some years it's very fashionable to have an EV car, some years it's less fashionable, so it'll go up and down. So we try to focus on what do we see 10, 15 years out. And the good news then is we are a diversified miner and we have a strong balance sheet. And that means that when you have choppy waters, like right now, you look at the stock indexes, etc., we try to not focus on that, but still keeping further out. And we can do that because we have a strong balance sheet.
Under basic policy scenarios today, we can't achieve any of these transition goals without a lot more copper mining and a lot more copper supply. And that's just that's the most critical mineral of all, in my view, because it's needed for the general economy. It's needed to do so many of these other things that we want to do in terms of electrification.
I think it's very difficult to tell Americans or Europeans or frankly people anywhere else in the world that they don't have a role to play in the clean energy transition other than being the consumer. I think that's just a very hard argument from the point of view of democracies selling a policy over the midterm. Second, I think it's wrong to trade one form of energy dependence from decades past on fossil fuels from the Middle East and elsewhere, for another form of energy dependence to a country like China that has been prepared to weaponize that dependence in other contexts over time.
Climate is one of the greatest drivers of migration in the world. If we don't solve this, you are going to continue to see the movement of people and things from the global south to the global north. Migration will continue in ways that are irregular and hard to manage for countries in the global north if we do not solve this climate challenge. The second one, to get to another issue that matters a great deal, is trade. I was just in South Africa. And in South Africa, I was there, and they have a huge plant that produces Ford vehicles. As you make the transition, will they be driving Ford vehicles, or will they be driving BYD vehicles? Should matter to us as well.
As time goes by, and the less money we put into changing industrial processes and energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the worse our situation is. Yeah. So this is a time-dependent issue, one which can't just be dismissed as saying, well, there it is. There it is not, I'm afraid. So it seems to me we've got plenty of things to do which can reduce the impact on the climate, greenhouse gas emissions, which really work on today's economics, and you can get them done. We have to also invest into tomorrow's technology, which will involve the integration, as always, of the best brains in the private sector and the university sector.
What you saw is that the meaningful shift we saw in policies across the world to prioritize climate less. Because if you take Wally's comments, I mean, it really is somewhat of a tragedy of the commons, right? Because no one country affects the overall trajectory. And so you had a big shift that, you had the Europeans go through Russia invading Ukraine and then realizing, wait a minute, we've prioritized climate so much, we have to think more about industrial competitiveness, about energy security for ourselves. You had Trump's election in the US clearly make the same turn to say we're really gonna prioritize much more industrial competitiveness, much more energy security for ourselves. So the landscape shifting away from prioritizing in any jurisdiction, I think really lowered the view that that transition risk was coming and made businesses feel less that they have to go after this.
This concept of the transition has really become synonymous with this concept of security and just having this sort of, homegrown source of energy and power. For us, certainly majority of what we've done has been, Western Europe and North America. We certainly have done things in parts of the world in the global south where, to your point, we've felt very comfortable with where we sit in the capital structure. In those situations, we tend to be secured, super senior, and get a fair amount more of confidence and returns there, based on that position.
I think we need to now be concerned about our fiscal trajectory again. The deficit now is 6 to 7% of GDP, twice what it was a decade ago. Debt as a share of the economy is a third higher than it was a decade ago.
And it's bigger than GDP.
And it depending on how you measure it, it's bigger than GDP. If not, it's going to get there really quickly. Interest rates are higher, and foreign creditors own $9 trillion of US debt. So there were some emergent tremors that may have been caused by people needing to cover the losses that they were experiencing in the stock market. That's one explanation. But another potential explanation was foreign investors starting to get a little bit nervous about the risk-free asset, the US Treasury bond,